I was part of the group that helped start the Rhode Island Latino Political Action Committee. And then when I became president, it became very clear to me that while the PAC was very important and had done some really good things, we were starting to get a lot of demands for civic education and to use PAC dollars for civic purposes and civic education purposes that were nonpartisan was not the best use of monies. So we then, under my leadership, actually created the C4 Rhode Island Latino Civic Fund, which exists to this day, and went on after my tenure to actually create all sorts of really great programs like Latina Leadership Institute and other things like that. But every now and then, you get 2 or 3 generations beyond the generation that created that, and I then went into the Secretary of State's office, and then when I came out, there were all sorts of questions about what was the purpose of the Civic Fund. Was the Civic Fund and the PAC the same organization, different organizations? How were it? It was, been there, done that. So anyway. So thank you so much for inviting me today to speak, and I'm really excited about getting to know the rest of you. I've had the privilege of getting to know some of you sort of one-on-one at different events. So yes, I'm Nellie Gorbea, and I'm running for Secretary of State. And I'm running for Secretary of State because I want to change the way government works. I want to make it work for all Rhode Islanders. And it's something that I feel absolutely passionate about. I've worked in the private sector, and I've worked in the public sector. In fact, I was Deputy Secretary of State for 4 years. I ran the office under Matt Brown. So I come into the position ready to lead on day one. I have a very good sense of what we need to do to really sort of upgrade that office and make it an absolutely national model. Usually in a lot of these groups I tend to touch base on, this is probably a more educated group than most in terms of what the Secretary of State's office does, but just in case, I'll go over the 4 main buckets. One is, of course, the one that a lot of people think about when they think Secretary of State is elections. And my North Star there is to make sure that that elections are held with integrity, that elections are fair, and that all eligible voters can and do vote. In addition to that, I think that there's some upgrades that we can do right now in that office. For example, when I was last there, we took 39 cities and towns voter registration lists and turned it into one master database. So that did all sorts of things for cleaning up the rolls, for saving tax dollars, because different communities were spending different amounts on all these different voting lists and the databases connected. And it really streamlined the process, and it allowed us as a state to be able to do things like get the voter information center up online. So now you're able to look up your voter registration or somebody else's, where you're going to go vote in polling place. You can look up your ballot before you go, and those are the kinds of things that technology could do at that time period that were really quite innovative. And it was a really fun project, and it sort of speaks to the kind of, I think, innovation that we need to bring right now into government. Corporations is the other really big area that a lot of people know because it's where organizations incorporate for-profits as well as not-for-profits. And here, I think that what we need to do is to take a step back and think about what is the information that we're collecting and how is it being used. And if it doesn't really have a purpose, then let's not collect it. And if there's other information that we need to collect, let's do that. So, for example, we have a corporations database, which right now, can tell you, 63 new businesses were started last quarter. But then you have to link through every single article of incorporation to see what those companies do. Why not ask those companies as they're incorporating, what kind of a company are you? Then we would be able to say, 63 companies were started and 20% are in technology and 5% are in manufacturing and 30% are in retail, and really get a sense for what the economy, where the economy is and where it's going. And so the Secretary of State is the Secretary of the state. It collects information. The question is, what do we do with that information? And how is it helpful? Is it helpful to grow the economy? Or is it helpful in the other area, which I care passionately about, which is open government? When I was last there, we passed the open meetings legislation that basically mandated that state agencies had to now use the new thing called the internet to upload their meeting notices and their meeting minutes. And for communities, that they had to at least upload their meeting notices. We couldn't at that time period actually get everybody on board to do the meeting minutes, and we can talk about the reasons why. But that, I think, at this point, we need to have sort of uniformly across the board. I think it makes sense. I mean, and those minutes should be available, and some communities have them, some communities don't. But definitely, we need to shed a light on what government does, how it works, and who is trying to influence government. And finally, the last area in the Secretary of State's office is the state archives and the state library. And that's a very important part of the Secretary of State's office in that it holds information that I think we need to get out more to kids, to teachers, to homeschooling parents. I have 3 daughters. I want to make sure that my daughters grow up understanding the important role that Rhode Island has played in the making of this country. And to highlight, really good uses of civic education or the archives. I mean, a community that doesn't know its history, that doesn't know the good, the bad, and the wonderfulness of the community that they live in, what ends up happening is what we have right now, which is everywhere else is better than we are. No, there are some great things. There's been some areas of our history that we struggled with, but then there are also some really good contributions that we've made. And I think that's very important. And in this part about, sort of civic engagement and civic education, I will say that one other area that I hope to bring attention to is actually adult civic literacy. And I should probably find a better name for it, but I wordsmith on that one, bear with me. We have a lot of adults that don't really understand how government works and don't have the time to pick up and link to 30 different websites to figure it all out. We had, in the olden days, a phone book that would have a community pages at the beginning of every phone book. I remember because when I got my first job in New Jersey, the first thing I did was, look at the front of the phone book and learn about sort of the history and the form of government and all that kind of stuff. Right now, the Secretary of State's website has the coloring book for the kids. And it has the government owner's manual, which is a fantastic tool, but you have to know how to use it. What it doesn't provide is a space where people, off a second shift could say, I'm tired of this pothole that nobody's fixing, who do I contact? Or just basic information that can be somewhat interactive and we can get people answers so that they can get government to respond to them. So, and with that said, I will say that, I'm not originally from Rhode Island. It took me a while to realize that when people ask, where are you from, they mean where am I living, as opposed to, and I would start by saying, well, I'm from Puerto Rico. Like, oh, but where do you live? Oh, yes, North Kingstown. So, it's just one of those things that is wonderful about Rhode Island. And so, actually, Rhode Island and Puerto Rico share a lot in common. I actually have grown to learn this over the years, and it's not just the weather today, but certainly they're both small places. They have this incredible love of family and community that I think comes from being in a small place. And we also measure distances very similarly, because anything over 15 minutes in Puerto Rico is a very long drive, and why would you go there? So, my husband, what brought me to Rhode Island was actually I came following my husband, who is a professor at the Oceanography School at URI. And we've made our home in North Kingstown, where we're raising our 3 daughters. And I love it here. I love the fact that you can get to know communities in all different parts of the state in a very short time period. The first thing I did when I got to the state was to get involved. And I've now have a 20-year plus track record of being involved in civic things as well as community organizations that really have led me to want to run for Secretary of State, to want the job of Secretary of State. And so, I'm a different kind of candidate, I think, because of what I've done, my track record, and what I hope to bring to the office. But it's all really good. And I believe that our best solutions are those that bring together a variety of people, perspectives, and opinions. And I think I can do that. I think it can help us find those new solutions that will move our government forward. So, and with your help, I will do that as well. And so I am here to ask for your support. And I know that there's going to be an endorsement sort of process with a questionnaire and everything, but I thought I'd throw that out there and get it out on the table. Yes?
When we met at the Movers and Shakers, we were talking about voter ID And that was something that I think that is very near and dear to our hearts, because we're really frustrated with the whole thing. And so I wanted to ask you to talk about that with the rest of us.
Sure. No. Yes, and I have, we've had this conversation. I definitely support a repeal of the voter ID legislation. It took me, it wasn't a sort of a slam dunk, it was through a process that I thought about it, but I really believe very strongly that we just don't have the evidence to put that kind of a barrier in front of something that's a fundamental right in a democracy. I mean, if you're gonna put any kind of challenge or barrier, it has to be because there's some absolutely incredible amount of evidence showing that we have a problem. And we didn't have that at that point in space and time. And so I would actually support the repeal. I mean, I'm someone who's been involved in getting people to register to vote and getting people to participate. So to find something that's there that's blocking people, it's keeping somehow people from voting is really quite troublesome. And it's funny because I'd forgotten, there are things that I've done that I've forgotten, and recently looking at the voter ID issue, I was looking at an opinion piece where they spoke about the fact that, here we were in the 90s doing voter registration process, the motor voter law. Well, I actually volunteered to represent the Governor's Commission on Hispanic Affairs on the task force that looked at, our voter registration processes way back then. And we struggled with, okay, if you're homeless, how do you fill out a voter registration card? How do we not disenfranchise people who happen to be homeless at that point in space and time? And so it's about, trying to make sure that everybody who's eligible can and does vote. And that should be the goal. So.
It absolutely seems crazy to spend money against somebody being able to vote.
Exactly.
It makes no sense.
Yes.
Monetarily for the state and budgets and things like that, it makes no sense to,
Yeah.
put forth money to keep people from
Totally.
And in Rhode Island it's particularly difficult. I'm going to give you a personal situation. I don't like to use those, but I will. When I moved here 8 years ago, I wanted to get a driver's license and couldn't. And the reason I couldn't get a driver's license is because my name on all of my documents going back to when I was 4 years old is Jerry. The name on my Social Security card, which is required to get a driver's license, you must use a Social Security card, which says do not use for identification. You must get that to get a driver's license. Of course, I don't have a Social Security card. I'm 60 or 50-something years old at the time. So I go and apply for a Social Security card. I finally get the Social Security card. It comes in, I bring it in, it says Gerard. That's my real name. They said, well, we can't give you a driver's license because your Social Security card says Gerard and your driver's license says Jerry. And your bar card, I'm a lawyer, says Jerry. And your credit card says Jerry. And every piece of identification says Jerry. So you can't do that. I said, so what do I do? They said, well, you got to go to court and change your name.
No.
I swear to God, I'm telling you that.
Oh my goodness.
And I finally it took 2 years for me to get a driver's license, and finally through a member of the General Assembly. They got a friend of theirs at the DMV to override the system. I went in, I had to ask for her, override the system, get my name in as Jerry, because all my driver's licenses in 3 states previously had been Jerry. So they couldn't put Jerry. So there was no way. I could have never voted. I could have never voted in Rhode Island if I hadn't either gone to court and changed my name or somebody with power was able to. And imagine people who don't have the ability to access the people that I can access. They'd never go through that. They'd never vote. Ever.
To say nothing of the fact that we're being used as a poster child by folks that are basically, it's voter suppression.
It is.
I mean, let's call it what it is. It's a voter suppression law. Yes.
Can I just to follow up on that, now from the Secretary of State's office, how specifically would you use that office to, because that would have to be, legislatively repealed.
Sure.
So would you be involved in drafting legislation with helping to whip votes on that as much as your position would allow you to in order to get sponsors for that particular piece of legislation? I mean, I'm sure that the sponsors are out there for that legislation. How specifically would you use the Office of Secretary of State to push that?
Well, you're right. It is a legislative issue, but yes, constitutional officers have a role to play in the passing of legislation. In fact, we did it for open meetings law, and we did it to designate the Secretary of State as chief state elections officer. So I mean, I am not one to sit back. I tend to sort of be very active. And so, you know, it'll depend on the circumstances of the moment, but, you know, I will be very much involved in I mean, repealing is repealing it. I mean, there's not much sort of in between, and so it'll depend on what the projects are, but I would, my position would be to try to get as close to repealing, if not possibly repealing it, as possible. And I do see myself involved in conversations and trying to, I mean, explain why it is. I mean, all of us, I mean, just as I would have a role, all of you around this table would have a role, as well as people outside of this room. Because we have to let our legislators know that was really a misstep in the history of the state. So.
I was shocked that it passed, but yeah.
Yes.
We have tried to let our legislators know.
Mm-hmm.
I remember our senator on the Judiciary Committee looking in bewilderment at her three constituents who were there and said, well, thanks a lot for coming. But the current Secretary of State has been critical in maintaining the law. And I think it's in fact going to be difficult to find sponsors, particularly in the Senate, because of the eminence of the chief sponsor in the Senate. So we will need your help. But we will
push.
Yes, we will be out there raising hell.
No, and actually, I have to say, I mean, I've talked to quite a number of legislators about this, and they seem to be, you know, quite focused on trying to get this done. So, you know,
Good.
I'm encouraged. Yes.
Your office establishes licenses for banks, right?
I want to say that's DBR. I don't remember.
It is DBR.
It's not Secretary of State. Okay.
Because would you be open to helping to support creating a bank,
Oh, the
a real bank of Rhode Island?
the infrastructure bank, or the is this the
Public
Tom
bank.
Segura's idea of
Yes.
a state infrastructure bank? I think it's a fascinating idea. I actually worked for the Government Development Bank in Puerto Rico, and I think, I mean, I'm open to looking at things like that, and seeing, you know, what possibilities it might have here. In fact, I've talked to Tom about that.
I was going to ask how you see campaign financing here in the state of Rhode Island, and whether the reporting is good, or it should be better, or public knowledge around campaign financing.
I can tell you I daydream about campaign finance reform these days, particularly in my race. So, you know, I think the reporting could definitely be streamlined and be more effective. The current setup at the Board of Elections, and I say this understanding it's very interesting that it is important that since the Secretary of State is an elected official, that function of government be kept in a very different place. So I think the Board of Elections is the right place for campaign finance reports. But that database needs some serious upgrading. And that's one of those things that, you know, I think, you know, if we could get a number of people involved, I think it would be good to question. But from the candidate point of view, I can tell you it is incredibly cumbersome. It
Just
requires
time-consuming for you to put
all the data in when there are software programs. I think it's the only database like it where you actually have to do double entry.
And then when we want to use it, it's not so great either.
Exactly. So yeah, no, I would very much support upgrading that particular database. You know, on the other stuff that I can think of, with regards to campaign finance reform, I think one of our biggest challenges is what happened in the Supreme Court. And it's incredibly troubling to me, and because some of the ideas that I have would fly, you know, sort of in contradiction to that. And I'm hopeful that at some point, you know, federally, we will see the error of the ways of what we've unleashed, and somehow come to terms with it. But more specifically on the database side of things here locally, yes, that is one piece of software that should definitely be upgraded.
Does that require a budget or
All these things always do require some sort of budget, but You know, I would think that you would get enough candidates out there to support both elected and non-elected, because I've never heard anybody say, wow, this is a really great process. So, yes.
So tax equity has been one of our big issues, and the increasing disparity, of course. Not even our president was just on that point. So wondering from your perspective as a candidate Secretary of State, what kinds of thoughts do you have about that issue, and how much you want to deal with it?
You know, I come into the Secretary of State's office pretty much focused on what's there and what can be improved there. And the tie-in to taxes is that I think that office can run better and leaner, and leaner in the sense of more efficiently than it does right now, meaning doing more for what's there. To the extent that we have that office running better, that might be a better use of tax dollars. There might be, you know, we might even be able to spend less on that office and allow for other programs to that really need it, and so the social safety net programs to actually be funded from that. The tax equity issue is a big one. I mean, I think, you know, we are seeing increasing studies about the disparities in this country. But I hesitate to sort of launch into that directly from the Secretary of State's office, because I think that's a pretty common mistake. I mean, if you either tackle what you have in front of you, or you can go and do all these other things. And so I would rather go first and foremost on what's in front of me at the Secretary of State's office, be a contributor, so that we can show that government can work well. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with the private sector is that the private sector doesn't believe that government is using their dollars effectively. If I can have a poster child to show that those dollars are being shown effectively, then we can have other conversations, I think, along the lines of tax equity. But I share your concern with it.
In general, do you believe in minimum wage should be increased? Not that that's directly with the Secretary of State's office, but just as a personal, do you feel that there needs to be a living wage versus a minimum wage?
I think that's one of the bigger topics here in the country, and I'm encouraged by the fact that the president is going to do something national. It always helps a little bit more when the feds do it than when we try to take it on at a local level. You know, I've seen the challenges that many families face from my work at Housing Works, Rhode Island, in trying to afford a reasonable rent. And so, you know, those are definitely concerns that I share in terms of, you know, how much are people able to earn versus what's the cost of living in a given community. If people are spending, we have 26% of our renters are spending 50% or more of their income on housing in Rhode Island. That's a really troubling statistic. How do you get around that, you know, in terms of, is a challenge. And it's not, there's not just one solution. I mean, wages are one factor of it, you know, costs are other. I mean, if we invested more heavily in affordable housing, you know, there might be a greater number of apartments out there as well that are deed restricted, that are there for people. So,
How much of your budget is financed by fees paid by the corp? Do you have LLC? Are there LLCs in
yes.
in Rhode Island?
Yes.
LLCs, corporations, partnerships.
Okay. So the way the Rhode Island state budget works, it's not like in other states where specific funds. So for example, we charge the corporations their annual incorporation fee, their annual fee, $500. Some people have real concerns about. Those money go directly to the general fund. So, and then we get funded from the general fund.
And so what percentage of your budget, annual budget, is returned to the general fund via fees paid by corporations and other stuff that you do?
I want to say that we greatly, we are a revenue generator for the state. I don't know the exact percentage. I could find out for you. I know that the 250 when the annual report filing fee went from $250 to $500, and some people want to roll that back. Rolling it back would cost probably some $20 million to $22 million. So
rolling it back to half,
and
that's
of it.
For corporations only.
Yes.
So you're doing $44 million a year.
At least in that one particular, that particular operation. So, you know.
And what's your annual budget? You know?
I don't remember it off the top of my head. I
Sorry.
haven't seen that number in a while. No, I know. You know, it's been interesting because I remember when I was there, it was around 6 million, I would say. Because then we got this massive influx of federal funds.
So you're creating $44 million in corporate fees a year going into a general budget for a budget of $6 million in your agency.
What it was back 10 years
Right.
ago, so don't quote me on that.
Not counting the other stuff, LLCs, 501c3s.
Yeah, and then there's like all the
other
smaller stuff, like, you know, notaries have to register, there's a number of registrations that have to happen. Lobbyists have to register for $5.
Yes, we do.
So it wouldn't be wrong to say you're probably pulling in at least $50 million a year, and it may be costing you $10 million a year. It may be costing us $10 million
Possibly,
a year.
yeah.
Something like that. That's nice. Yeah.
You were talking about one of the elements being the corporate database, which is something I access on a regular basis.
Oh,
And-
good.
Well, I do.
Tell me about it.
Well,
How is it?
I do it for work.
Mhm.
I work for the Department of Labor and Training, and I work specifically for unemployment insurance. And so whenever we're concerned about, you know, companies call themselves one thing, but they're really something else. But then there's something else, but they're under an umbrella. So yeah, I'm looking through their articles of incorporation constantly to try and figure out what the most recent incarnation is and what their most recent employer record number is. Now. You had talked about, you know, trying to use that corporate database and take that data and actually use it for something positive, to try and aggregate that, to try and come up with some different types of statistics. What is, you know, what are areas of growth, what are areas of decline,
Yep.
and everything in between.
Sorry.
And it's okay. And so how would that, I mean, would you be working in tandem, because right now the DLT's labor market information unit does quite a bit of that already. I don't know how exactly they work specifically with that. That I currently refer to it as mollis.com, but it could be end up, you know, Gorbea.com pretty soon. But you know, LMI does a lot of that for prevailing wages, for trying to determine, you know, for example, every licensed nurse practitioner out there, there's 9 open positions. For every construction worker, there's 1 position for every 9 people trying to get it. So these are the kinds of statistics that LMI takes a look at. And would you be working in tandem with the DLT, with Fogarty, or whoever happens to be there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I bring to the table is because I've worked in the nonprofit sector where we do a lot of collaboration. We did it when I was at Secretary of State's as well. It was a little bit harder because it really depends on the leadership in the governor's office. When we went in, it was the first tenure for Carcieri, and you know, it wasn't as easy to, you know, garner sort of the right kind of leadership to do those kinds of cross-silo projects. I am very optimistic that come, you know, the next administration, we'll have some, you know, at least 4 new, you know, constitutional officers, and some really neat collaboration can happen. It's the only way we'll move things forward. We cannot sit in one place and say, okay, well, I'm going to do it this way because it's my, you know, this is my turf and this is my budget. No. You know, I think one of the biggest challenges in public administration today is precisely that. How do we get departments to work across like budget lines? So I saw it, for example, on housing issues, where you have a policy that's been proven to be effective to take chronically homeless people off the street. It's called permanent supportive housing. Now, the biggest problem we have is who pays for the wraparound services, because some of the money's in you know, in DHS, the other one's in sort of mental health, the other one's in elderly, and how do you cobble that together in a way, given our accounting system, if you will? We know that the program keeps people housed and that keeps them out of the crisis intervention and the very costly ways in which we do business in those sectors. So then, you know, but we can't save money this particular fiscal year where there's a gap of $40 million. Getting government to look beyond that and move forward is, I think, one of the most important public administration problems in our day. I don't have the solutions to it. I will say this, I do not believe in redundancy, and I do believe in sort of reaching across. So when we, for example, were there, we wanted to do a one-stop web portal. Mollis then came through and actually improved it quite dramatically in terms of the look and feel. But we had started with a basic, okay, we wanted people to just go through our office, and then from there the information would populate other forms and other agencies, at DEM, at Health. And we ran into the brick wall. Now, we only have Word documents, and you can't access them. So, okay. You know, well, but this is going to be better for the small business, for the economy. No, yeah, we don't have the resources, we don't have the people. You know, it got very difficult. But that's one of the challenges of government. It's sort of the wheeling and cajoling and leading people and saying, no, I get that we have these issues, but can we look at it this way? But yes, I would want to make sure that whatever we do doesn't duplicate necessarily what's there, or for example, a Department of Revenue. We'd have to see how they do their databases. I want to say that I think there's a niche for the Secretary of State's office in that we are the first place. So before you even hire employees, before you even have revenue to report, we're like the first place. So it's like an initial pulse on the economy. On the other side, when people don't file their annual reports, if we've already tagged those companies, then we can say, oh, we're having problems in these particular sectors. So it's about information, ready to use. It's ready to, easy to get, easy to use. Yes.
Would your office be a place that you could have, so we have 39 cities and towns, 39 cities and towns,
yep.
And they all have, they all call for bid on jobs, and it's very difficult for contractors and people to find that information, and if it were all located in one place, would your website, were you to win, would your website be the place?
That's an interesting idea.
Would that be a database you could?
I'd be open to exploring it. I mean, again, it's one of those things where, like for example, we offered it on open meetings. The technology exists for the meeting minutes to be uploaded to our site. I don't see why we couldn't, do something like that on an experimental basis almost. The challenge here is to build up the technology resources, human resources within the office to really be able to support that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's about being a resource, both to other government agencies as much as you are to the localities. And again, having worked in the nonprofit sector where you sort of look at opportunities of collaboration and see where you can add value and do things cheaply and effectively, I mean, I think I'd be willing to explore that. I would see why not.
Where is it presently? On each, like DOT?
Yeah.
DOT would have their own, and the transportation would have its own, and everybody would, is that right?
In every town.
Although it might be more effective
And every town has
if
its
people
own.
are already going to the DOA, it may be something that we should talk about with that particular web pro, that particular portal. We'd want to make sure that it would be located in a way and placed in a way that it would make sense.
Right.
So.
It could be a single page with the various.
Yeah.
You could have the transportation and
Yeah.
DOT and whatever, I suppose, but all every RFP or every
Bid request.
every bid request for proposal, everything could all be on the same page, I suppose, and just go to whatever concerns you.
When we were there, we were considered pretty radical because we were using RSS feeds. For those who are techie. For those who are not, it's basically a way in which if you upload on the Secretary of State's office the rules and regs of your agency, you could sign up and get an email every time the health department uploaded rules and regs. And those actually could even appear in your own website, as a direct feed, and things like that. There's all sorts of things that we could be doing that we're not, and that I think would open up government, would make it more accessible, get the information out. Because why are we collecting the information if it's not useful to people?
Going back to voter ID real quick, I'm glad to ask a couple questions.
Sure.
It's great, and that's a huge thing about the voter ID repeal, but would you try to expand voter access? So expand maybe online voting or voting hours, more polling places, that type of thing to kind of, enhance the experience, make it a better experience for people.
I think that absolutely we have to do that for people. I mean, it has to be easy for people to vote. Having said that, then the devil is in the details. What exactly do you do given whatever resources, and given, honestly, the jurisdictional authority of different entities. The Board of Elections handles the polling places with the local boards of councilors. So I can't stand here before you and say, I'm gonna do this and this and this for that purpose. I can, however, put together a convening hosted by the Secretary of State to have poll workers and other entities and invite the Board of Elections and the local boards of councilors to have a conversation about how we can do that. What I can do is bring attention to the topic. I can't order anybody to do anything with it, but you know, there's something to be said for bringing people together and saying, you know, there's a different way of doing this. And that's what leadership is about. It's about bringing people together to move in a particular direction, but hopefully it's positive. So,
I would just say that when we were giving testimony on the voter ID thing, one of the things that came before the Senate Judiciary Committee before that or whatever had to do with they were trying to close down and consolidate, as we saw, districts to save money, which created terrible problems. But they were talking about, you know, saving money. They were also talking about, and I don't know who the jurisdiction is on training poll workers. Is that just?
That's the Board of Elections.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, the poll workers know nothing about. A lot of them know very little and are paid terribly. And pardon me?
They know nothing about provisional ballots.
Right. They don't know that, and they also do a terrible job. So yeah, I mean, education of in the whole and raising funds and
and it goes back to civic education, constant civic
exactly.
education that we need to have. I actually worked as a poll worker. I had wanted for years to do that, and finally was able to do it. Actually in North Providence, and it was the primary where they first implemented voter ID.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see how it would go.
Right.
You know, and I will tell you this: there were no issues at that particular polling place, and it was interesting. It was interesting to go through the training to see who else was there. In our particular polling place, somebody didn't show up, and they were able to tap. This is in North Providence. They were able to tap a high school student to come and work. I thought that was fantastic. You know, it was a long day for some of the people.
For $75, it's an incredibly long day. But who is in charge of the board? I'm very.
That's the Board of Elections.
Yeah, and who is in charge of? I guess there's a.
Who oversees them?
I don't want to take your time for
No,
something
okay.
that you're not, is not part of your jurisdiction.
And yet, it's near and dear to my heart because I do want people to come out and vote. I mean,
Right,
that's
yeah.
the whole thing. Like,
Yeah,
we need to get
exactly.
people to get out. You know, want to go out and vote. I know. Okay, I must admit, I am somewhat of a government wonk, and so like I actually wake up election day very excited. Like,
I think a lot of people do.
yeah. So
What
we
happens?
want other people to share that because you know a community that's engaged in voting is actually a community that is thinking about its future. So the more people we can get involved that way, the better we are in terms of getting people thinking about, okay, where are we going as a community? I mean, that's the decision that you're making at the poll, really, is what's that leadership that's going to take you forward. I had this experience the other day at a meat market that's down in South Providence. And I'll go there to buy my special Hispanic cuts of meat. And this woman, who's also Puerto Rican, comes up to me, and we knew each other, and she knew I was running, and then, you know, suddenly she came up to me and she's like, you know, I was embarrassed to tell you, but I've never voted. In fact, I hadn't registered to vote, and so when you told me that you were running, I was embarrassed. I'm like, how can you do it? You know, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. We can register the minute we're in a state. You know, all that, you know. But and what she said was, when I heard that you were that you were on the ballot, I wanted to be there too. So I asked a friend of mine to download the form with me, and we filled it out, and I mailed it in, and I got my voter card that tells me where I'm going. And this woman was all excited about going and voting, and part of me was absolutely overcome with emotion because, you know, that woman, suddenly that ballot was speaking to her. There's something on it that she actually cares about. And so she's going to go out and vote. And hopefully she'll figure out that it's an easy enough process that she'll go out and do it again. And so it's about that. It's about getting as many people to have a positive experience in the polls so that they know that they can just come in and out and do it. And although, again, the Secretary of State does not have direct jurisdiction, we certainly have a bully pulpit. And we certainly have the capacity to engage people in conversations about this. Not just 6 weeks before elections, but the entire, sort of tenure of the 4 years that you're there. I mean, in anything, you're the democracy cheerleader for this community. Let's go out, people. This is how you find out what's going on. This is how you do it. This is how you can actually have a voice. It's exciting stuff.
And this also can be considered voter intimidation versus sometimes voter repression, because when you just may be intimidated saying, I don't have the right document, I want this or that, so I'm not even going to try. So it's just, you don't even know how many people didn't vote because they were just intimidated.
Well, that's exactly right, Martin. And when you say that, that you were at the poll and there was no problems there at all.
At the poll.
Maybe there weren't any problems, but how many people didn't come because...
Yep, exactly. That's true.
And that's the problem.
Yep.
That's the real problem. It's not provisional ballots. It's not that. It's people that
Those
just
people
won't
know
vote.
how they're going to vote,
Exactly.
right,
They
because
don't
they know
wanna be
about it.
They don't want to be intimidated. They know they're going to have a vote.
And they would hope that, you would change I mean, Mr. Marlis has done a tremendous disservice to the state, and he worked very hard to get voter ID installed. And so we would love it if somebody came along and healed that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, so it's my understanding that in this particular Democratic primary, we are both in favor of repealing it. So, hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel in this particular topic area.
Right.
Speaking of your upcoming primary, it's been a hotly talked about race early on. We lost a candidate and now there's only two.
Yes.
But you guys have both been hot on the campaign trail, and wonder if you could share with us some of the endorsements that you may have picked up along the way that might interest some of us.
Sure, definitely. So Mayor James Diosa is the most recent one from Central Falls, and I was very excited. I mean, that's a city that is totally engaged in its future. I mean, you finally have a community that's really participating, and I think that's fantastic. Stephanie-elect, Councilwoman-elect Stephanie Gonzalez as well in Central Falls, but more locally here in Providence, I was thrilled to receive Representative Edie Aiello's endorsement, Representative Art Handy's, former Senator Rhoda Perry, and there's a few other ones that I have to sort of hold back on, but some of those, those are some of the ones that Luisa Ponte, who's the councilman here in Providence, it's exciting. I'm really pleased to have garnered those pretty good, endorsements, and look forward to working with them on a lot of different topics. Yes.
What do you think separates you from your opponent, Guillaume?
Well, he is taller. He is taller. So I have to tell you, if I look at both resumes without names, I will say that I am the better qualified candidate. I mean, and it's because of my track record over the last 20 years. I came into this position of running for Secretary of State because of a history of being involved in these topics, whether it be civic engagement, voter-related activities, public policy. And so that's really what's driven me to run for Secretary of State. And I would not run for any other seat, really, honestly, because I care so deeply about it. So, I mean, I think that's really a fundamental difference in terms of how we came upon it and what the track record is. And I am ready to lead on day one, that office. I know that the employees there, 80% of those employees probably are, the same employees that I worked with, and that I had the pleasure to work with, because I think that it's a great team of people, and which is part of why I'm so excited about going in there for a second turn around, if you will. Because I know that they're a group of very committed people that actually are giving taxpayers a good value for their money. So we're going to do some really fun things. And my management style is very inclusive. So I look forward to having conversations with them about, you know, what things do you think we could be doing better, which is something that I did in the first time around as well. So.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate you coming